Okay, so I know I'm like 3 years late to this trend, but I wanted to make this video because I love disturbing media and have recently been reading a couple of disturbing books. I haven't read every book on this iceberg, but I have read a lot of them and I've done my research on the others. If you don't know what an iceberg chart is, it's an image of an iceberg with items ranked based on their level of obscurity or depravity in this case. As you go deeper down, the more intense the media, in this case books, becomes. I was originally going to do a separate video for each layer of this iceberg, but then I had the idea to cover the iceberg over the course of a few videos by talking about a selection of books from each section over the course of one video. So this first video will not cover every book on this iceberg, but it will cover several books from each section of this iceberg. So if you're here for some of the more intense stuff, you will surely find it near the end of the video. I just wanted to avoid the trap of making an iceberg that only covers the tame stuff, so I feel this format is a good compromise. If you like disturbing content and enjoy this video, then please consider subscribing. I'm very close to 1,000 subs, which has been a goal of mine since I started this channel. And credit to this iceberg goes to KindlyPatrick from the Iceberg Chart subreddit. Without further ado, let's get into it. Level 1. It is a horror novel written by Stephen King that I actually have read before. It details the lives of a group of kids who grew up in Derry, Maine. The kids are seen as outcasts and face a lot of bullying and abuse by people in the town and their own family members. They're also tormented by Pennywise the dancing clown. Pennywise is an ancient alien that shows up in Derry every 27 years to feed on children. It's also a shapeshifter that takes the form of what the kids are most afraid of, and is one of the main reasons that clowns become known as something scary now. Well, I guess Pennywise and John Wayne Gacy Jr., but that's besides the point. The book definitely has some disturbing moments regarding Pennywise's torment of the kids. He shows up as a leper to one of the kids who is a germaphobe. He also bites off the arm of a little kid who loses a toy boat down in the storm drain. Nothing too crazy happens, which is why this is kind of at the top of the list for this iceberg. But probably the most infamous and controversial scene in the book is where the children are stuck in the sewers of the town after defeating Pennywise, and they decide that they need to grow up in order to escape the sewers. They do this by all having intercourse with the one girl in the friend group. It's a little distasteful to depict literal children having sex with each other. I think Stephen King somewhat regrets that, as it didn't make it into either of the film adaptations of the story. The book is also like 1,000 pages long, and I kind of have a hard time recommending it. King has so many other books that are shorter and more interesting in my opinion. The movie adaptations are both pretty good though, and they get across most of the story, so I would just watch those instead, honestly. Pet Sematary is another Stephen King book about a burial ground that brings things back to life after they've been buried, only they come back hollow and evil and like kind of zombie-like in a sense. This is seen when a man's 2-year-old son dies and he decides to bury him in the burial ground, leaving him to come back to life and start terrorizing the rest of his family. I've read this book as well. I didn't find it too disturbing. It's probably why it's near the top here. The lore of the book is interesting, especially the burial ground, and I think some of the horror is really well done. There is a bit about killing people with a scalpel, and I don't know why, but the idea of killing somebody with a scalpel is really creepy and eerie to me. I haven't bothered with the movie adaptations, so if you've seen them, then please let me know how they are. I'd love to watch those someday, but again, I'm just not sure if they're very good. The Yellow Wallpaper is a really great short story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, written in the 80s. This is an easy recommendation for me to all you guys. It's really great and it's really short. It's about a woman suffering from postpartum depression, which is depression that can set in after women have given birth. The doctor then decides that the best cure for this is to essentially lock her away from her child in a room with yellow wallpaper. This is actually the opposite of what should be done when it comes to postpartum depression. Separating the mother from her child is just a terrible idea, but this did used to happen back in the day, so it is kind of based on true events. Anyways, the woman starts going crazy and thinks she sees a woman in the pattern of the yellow wallpaper. Eventually, she fully loses it, thinking that she is that woman inside the yellow wallpaper. The husband eventually comes into the room and then faints at the sight of his crazed wife as she continues to creep around the room and then around his body, claiming that she has finally got out of the room and now has become the woman in the wallpaper. Again, I highly recommend it. It's a quick read, but it's also really creepy and it's just written very, very well. Flowers in the Attic, in my opinion, is notably more disturbing than the past couple books. It details the story of a family with 4 children, a boy, a girl, and a set of young twins that are boy and girl. The father of the family is killed in a car crash, and the mother of the family needs money, so she goes back to win the favor of her rich father. She goes back to live in her childhood home with her dying father, but reveals that she was disinherited from the will for marrying her husband, and that she was never to have children with him. She then forces her kids to secretly live in the attic until her father dies, so he doesn't find out, and gives her the will again. We then learn learn that the reason that the mother was disinherited is that her former husband was actually her half-uncle, and now her mother thinks that her children are spawn of the devil because they were formed through incest. The children live in the attic in isolation, and the two older siblings, the boy and the girl, grow an attraction to each other, so yikes. This leads to some SA between the siblings, and the grandmother ends up cutting off their food supply before trying to make it up to them by giving them the occasional powdered donut. Eventually, one of the kids dies, and at the end of everything, we find out the kids were being poisoned through the donuts, which were actually most likely given to them by the mother who was trying to kill her own kids. Pretty gnarly stuff. Watership Down is a 1972 novel by Richard Adams about a small group of rabbits who live in their natural habitat but are also anthropomorphized and have their own history and mythology and poetry and culture. The book is notable for appearing like it might be a nice kid's book about rabbits when it's actually much, much darker than that. Same with the movie. The book contains the death of several animals, an oppressive society of rabbits, and the grim reality that rabbits on the farm are only taken care of in order to be skinned and butchered at the end of their lives. This was also made into an animated film that has been really traumatizing for a lot of people because it looks like a Disney cartoon up until the animals start dying and going through horrifying experiences. The Amityville Horror is a 1977 novel that spawned a series of films, one of them starring Ryan Reynolds. The book was written by Jay Anson, and it claims to tell the true story of the Lutz family, who bought a house in Amityville after it was the site of a mass murder of 6 people by Ronald DeFeo Jr. The book details the killing by Ronald DeFeo Jr. and also describes the paranormal events that the Lutz family claimed to have witnessed, including everybody in the house waking up at night around the time of the murder, the family hearing a low voice telling them to get out, and even a greenish black slime that started following the family up the staircase. Literally like that scene from SpongeBob. I wonder if that's what they were making fun of in the Hashling Slasher episode. The book is heavily disputed though. The lawyer for Ronald DeFeo Jr. has gone on record saying that they made the whole thing up over many bottles of wine. None of the passages of the book that I read were that disturbing or haunting beyond the base level of disturbing that comes with, the murder of a family. Level 2. House of Leaves is a 2000 psychological horror novel written by Mark Z. Danielewski. This is another one that I have read personally, and the book is incredibly interesting in the way that it chooses to tell its story. The book follows a man who finds a manuscript for an unpublished novel that is an analysis for a documentary that doesn't exist. The only other issue being that the manuscript was written by a blind man who could not have possibly watched any movie in the first place. The manuscript details a movie that follows a famous photographer that moves into a house with his family and slowly starts to realize that the house is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. It starts off small, just a couple of inches bigger on the inside, but soon the house grows new rooms and hallways. The manuscript also seems to have a negative effect on those who read it, as illustrated by the meta-narrative of the reader starting to grow more and more paranoid with each passing day. The book is definitely unsettling. I had to stop reading it at night because it was just freaking me out too much, which never happens for me. One part that got to me was a series of letters written to the reader of the manuscript from his mother, who was in a mental hospital. The mother describes the terrible things that are happening to her at the institution, and it goes down some pretty dark places. I would recommend this book to anyone who loves puzzles or ARGs, and especially if you're interested in the backrooms, as this book was essentially the backrooms before the backrooms. It's really interesting and definitely does a good job of creeping the reader out. 120 Days of Sodom is a pretty significant jump in terms of disturbing content, but I assume it's this high up given that the novel was never actually finished. It still only exists as a first draft written by the French author Marquis de Sade in 1785. This book details the story of 4 wealthy Frenchmen who seek to find ultimate sexual gratification and kidnap a group of young teenagers to use in their sick retreat to an inaccessible castle in the woods. They are also accompanied by 4 middle-aged women who live their lives in debauchery and filth. The book is split into an introduction and then 4 sections describing the stories of unspeakable acts committed by those involved in this months-long endeavor. I'm going to describe some of what is talked about in these sections, so buckle up. Thank goodness I'm not monetized because this section would kill any hopes of that anyway. The first section details the simple passions, or acts that don't involve any actual sexual intercourse. Those being stories of the sexual abuse of children, drinking urine, drinking vomit, eating feces, and necrophilia. The second section describes complex passions, and this mostly involves stories of the sexual assault of children and women during Mass and other religious scenarios, as well as stories of incest, which is just a major theme throughout the entire novel. The third section is about the criminal passions, as if what we have heard already wouldn't constitute criminal conduct. These include more sexual assault of children, men who prostitute their own daughters and then watch what goes down, and the mutilation of women during intercourse by tearing off their fingers or burning them with hot pokers. The fourth and final section is about the murderous passions, which include children being skinned alive, pregnant women being disemboweled, burning entire families alive, and the murder of newborn babies right in front of their mothers. The murder of a girl is also described in detail. Overall, this book feels like it should be a lot further down on this iceberg. I think it's higher up because it's not like super detailed in what it talks about, but it is all incredibly depraved and disgusting. There's also a movie adaptation of this book that is pretty disturbing as well. I wouldn't recommend reading this unless you want to get into some truly depraved stuff. A Clockwork Orange is a 1962 dystopian novel written by Anthony Burgess that was turned into a film directed by Stanley Kubrick. The book is about a boy named Alex who runs around with his gang of criminals and terrorizes the people that they come in contact with. There are several instances of sexual assault in this book, as well as violence inflicted on innocent people. There is also a degree of psychological horror in the novel as well, since Alex is eventually submitted to experimental treatment that amounts to torture. But honestly, by the time you get to the torture on Alex, he's done some awful stuff, so it's like, he kind of deserves it. The book takes a look at senseless violence and those that perpetrate that violence and a society that tolerates this kind of stuff. I mean, obviously he goes to jail eventually, but they do tolerate kind of a growing level of violence with the community. We'll see that in a later book as well. Our main character is subjected to violence against him and is eventually made to face up to the consequences of his violent actions as a youth. This book is definitely disturbing, but nowhere near as bad as the last book we talked about. If you've seen the movie, then I would recommend giving the book a read, since the movie essentially omits the last chapter of the book, which provides some hope to the reader in the end, which makes it yet another book that was turned into a movie adaptation directed by Stanley Kubrick, where the original author of that book denounced the movie. Stephen King did a very similar thing with Kubrick's The Shining, since it differs so much from his original novel. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket is a novel written by the legendary Edgar Allan Poe. This is notable since Poe almost exclusively wrote poetry at that point, but he wanted to prove that he could write a longer narrative as well. The story follows a man named Arthur Pym who stows away on a whaling vessel called the Grampus and ends up in all sorts of trouble. There are depictions and descriptions of murder and decaying corpses and all sorts of nasty stuff throughout the book. Also, literally as I'm recording this video, it's funny that the vessel he is on is called the Grampus, because this was turned into a Mike Flanagan show on Netflix, and that's what they call the grandpa, as Grampus. And I always thought it was weird, but that's where it comes from, which is super cool. I wouldn't call it particularly disturbing in terms of subject matter, but Poe does have a way of writing that makes you just feel on edge the entire time, and that was definitely getting to me as I read through some passages of this book. The character of Arthur Pym was adapted in Mike Flanagan's The Fall of the House of Usher that I talked about just a second ago. It's a show on Netflix, and I would highly recommend it to anybody who loves horror. That show is essentially a mashup of various different Edgar Allan Poe poems and stories, and it was absolutely one of my favorite things that came out the year that it was released. The Road is a 2006 post-apocalyptic novel written by Cormac McCarthy about a man and his son that are struggling to survive in a desolate world full of people and things that just want to kill them. The title of this book is The Road because the father and son mostly stick to a singular road as they make their way to the coast. This book is really good, and it does a really great job of making the reader feel the hopelessness of the situation that the main characters are in. They only have a tiny amount of food and are hard-pressed to find any more food than that, and everything they carry is inside a shopping cart that they push for miles and miles a day. The world and society has devolved to a point where groups of people hunt others to kill them and either eat them or just steal all of their food and supplies. The father is also sick and he knows he will die soon. They have a pistol with a couple of bullets, and the father leaves it with the son whenever they are in danger, as he has taught the boy to kill himself if he ever gets captured. We also learn that the mother of the family already took her own life, and that is why the father and the son are alone. The entire novel is incredibly bleak, and you never really know what is going to happen to the two. It's also really interesting and kind of realistic that their goal is just to make it to the coast. They don't have any sort of safe haven that they want to get to. The son just wants to see the ocean, and they have nowhere better to go, so they just make their way there. Easily the most disturbing portion of this novel is when the boy and the father sneak into someone's cellar, where they find a bunch of people chained up with chunks of flesh taken out of them. They are being used as human livestock and are being slowly eaten by the owner of the cellar. That image is just incredibly distressing, and it's portrayed really well in the movie that was made about the book. It's got Viggo Mortensen in it. It's awesome. I'd recommend the movie if you're looking for something depressing that kind of accurately depicts what an apocalypse would look like for most people. You wouldn't be running around and killing zombies with chainsaws. You'd be starving to death. Survivor is a satirical novel written by Chuck Palahniuk about a man named Tender Branson, who is one of the only surviving members of a death cult. The cult committed mass suicide several years ago, and now the surviving members are meant to serve humanity and then end their own lives when they receive a sign. The book is definitely disturbing in the way that it deals with suicide in a very flippant manner. It's supposed to be a dark comedy though, so that definitely lessens the impact of what is being said. There's a lot of Tender wanting to end his own life, but also getting more and more famous and wanting his death to be more meaningful and reach the most amount of people. I mean, it's literally talked about like investing in like crypto and wanting to hit the highest high before you sell. He wants his death to be the most impactful to the most amount of people and like wants to keep holding on until more people know about him. I'd say the most disturbing part is when one character is asked to disfigure another character by smashing them in the face with a rock. The character that is being hit with the rock just encourages the other person to continue hitting them until they eventually die from the trauma. That passage was probably the most difficult to get through, but this would be another one that I would recommend if you aren't bothered by dark subject matter. I love books about fake cults, and the limited mythology presented about the death cult is very fascinating. Overall, definitely pretty disturbing, but also something that I think most people could handle if you like satire. If you're someone who just wants to read something hardcore and messed up, then I would honestly read something further down on this list or just read 120 Days of Sodom because that book is terrible and depraved. Level 3. The Troop by Nick Cutter is a book that I have covered extensively on this channel in a different video that I would highly suggest that you watch. It is a book about a group of Boy Scouts who go camping on an uninhabited island before they are confronted by a man carrying a deadly parasite. Now, this book was definitely disturbing, but for a different reason than you might be thinking. There is an extended sequence of two people attempting to kill a sea turtle that goes on for a very long time, and that was easily the hardest part of the novel to get through. Animal torture and killing is just hard for me to read. And now don't get me wrong, the boys get really messed up throughout the story and it definitely has some squeamish sections involving self-mutilation and people eating things they really shouldn't be eating, including like their own fingernails and skin. There's also a character that is just an absolute psychopath and he's really easy to hate, which honestly is a great thing for the story. The book is also pretty short, so if you're looking for something disturbing, then I would give it a read. It's not the most disturbing thing that you'll ever read, but it'll probably make you more scared of camping than you were before. I know that's what happened to me. I was actually in Boy Scouts growing up, and me and my scout troop once did a camp out on an uninhabited island in Washington, so I really connected with this book. That just made the entire thing more impactful to me, so maybe if you don't have the experience, then the book wouldn't get to you quite as much. All Tomorrows is a 2006 work of science fiction that explores a hypothetical path of human evolution into the distant future. This book is available for free as a PDF, so it's not hard to recommend this one. Most of the disturbing aspects of this book or experience comes from the body horror of it all. In this distant future, a new race of aliens is traveling around the galaxy and genetically mutating species into creatures that they see as better. Because of this, most of the book explores humans that have been twisted into unrecognizable creatures and the horror that all that entails. There are worms who are humans that have been stretched into large worm creatures who dig in the ground and still have the remnants of feet and human skin. Those are particularly haunting to me. You also have these massive titans who have been twisted into something that resembles an elephant but still has human characteristics but can't like speak or anything. Most of the book is just depictions of these creatures, and it's really interesting to see. The idea of an invading species completely dominating and deforming humans into what they want them to be is really creepy to me. It's like the movie Tusk that is a horror comedy, but the premise has always creeped me out and made me really unsettled. The book also talks about the colonials, who are the people that were most resistant to the will of the invading species and were thus punished for that. They were essentially turned into fleshy bottom feeders that could still think and feel but were forced to live in an unrecognizable body and feed on the waste products of the other species. This punishment for resisting their new overlords essentially carried on for 40 million years, with each new generation being born into the most miserable lives possible. When the invading species left, they hoped that they would just die out quickly, like the species hoped they would die out quickly. But they persisted and formed what is essentially like a massive quilt of flesh over the entire planet. I mean, literally all of them were hoping to be put out of their misery, but they had been given the ability to survive on almost no sustenance and in any situation possible, so now they were forced to live forever. It's very similar to Ted's fate in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. But anyway, that's one that I really check out. It's a quick read, and I really enjoyed it. It's really eerie and creepy, and if you get creeped out by body horror, then this one will definitely get to you. I know it gets to me. The Cabin at the End of the World is a 2016 horror novel by Paul Tremblay about a couple and their adopted daughter vacationing at a remote lakeside cabin. They are eventually confronted by four strangers in like a home invasion scenario who tell them that two of them must sacrifice the other one in order to stop the coming apocalypse. I have read this novel and I actually really enjoyed it. It was made into a movie a couple of years ago that changed some key aspects from the book, and I didn't really enjoy the movie that much because of that. It definitely has some disturbing elements to it though. There are some particularly gruesome deaths that happen, and one of the potential victims is a small child, which just makes the scenario even more tense. The book keeps you in suspense because you are never really sure whether the strangers are serious or if they're just completely insane and wanting to victimize this vulnerable family. I would recommend this book if you're watching this video and want something a little less intense. There is a chapter in this book that is really difficult to get through, and I will spoil that here in like 5 seconds. So if you want to read the book, then please click away. All right, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, the little girl ends up dying in a pretty violent way, and it's pretty emotional. She's built up really well throughout the story, and to see her be killed and then the rest of the people having to deal with the fallout of that accident is really tough. If you think you can handle that, then I would suggest reading the book. It's really good. The movie fails to commit to some of the more disturbing aspects of the book, which I think makes it not as good. The biggest difference being that the daughter does not die in the movie. I get that showing a child death on screen is usually a no-no unless your doctors sleep for some reason, but I felt that it just took a lot of the bite and impact out of the story. Last Days is a 2012 found footage horror novel about a man who is hired to make a documentary about a doomsday cult that is no longer operating after the dramatic and bloody deaths of almost everybody involved in the cult. This is another one that I have read, and I don't know if I would call it particularly disturbing. It is a book about a fictional cult, but it does borrow a lot of elements from real-life cults. The idea of it being a documentary and the novel sort of being like a found footage recounting of that is an interesting framing device that I really enjoyed. The most disturbing part of the novel comes about 80% of the way through when we are given some backstory of the cult and are told about some horrifying events that happened centuries prior. It definitely gave me some Hanged King vibes. If you know what that is, it's an SCP. The pacing of the book is pretty slow, but there are some great moments that talk about murder and the horrible conditions that the cult members lived in. They were forced to share a large mansion at one point with not nearly enough room for everyone, and the women were forced to act as prostitutes in order to bring more people into the cult. The problem is that I can't really recommend this book because while the first 80% of it is really interesting, the last 20% turns into like a bad Resident Evil fan fiction. They introduce a gun-toting American character who helps the documentary crew storm a compound that is essentially full of zombies. It's really lame. The best thing that this book did for me was telling me about a book called Raven that is a real comprehensive biography about the famous cult leader Jim Jones. I want to do a video on him someday as I found that book to be incredibly fascinating, and it's just interesting because he's so evil and terrible and all the stuff he did was crazy, but I'll start working on that video someday. For now, more disturbing books. The Moth Diaries is a 2002 gothic horror novel about a girl living at a boarding school after her father has committed suicide. A new student shows up and starts to steal all of her friends, while most of her close friends and confidants start getting injured and dying. The book is presented as a diary of a teenage girl and is definitely disturbing in the way that it talks about self-harm and suicide, which are both major themes of the story. It's a story about social isolation and feeling like everybody around you is turning against you or leaving in your life. Most of the disturbing content revolves around our main character contemplating self-harm and trying to keep herself afloat from the depression that seeps into her life as her friends start abandoning her one by one. The girl who shows up to steal all of her friends is also creepy and is hinted at being a vampire, which is also interesting and a weird twist. This kind of book isn't particularly interesting to me, but I do think it could be an interesting read if you are interested in non-conventional methods of writing and storytelling. There's definitely a mystery to be found in the book and a couple of gruesome moments along the way. Again, probably not my thing, but I'm sure some of you guys would love it. Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk, who's a guy that we covered earlier, is an insane horror novel that is so bizarre with how it tells its story that it loops back around from being disturbing into just being kind of funny. The book is a series of short stories that are told through a really unique framing device. 17 writers are locked inside a theater with enough food and water to last them weeks, but they won't be released until they produce a magnum opus or their best work yet. Realizing that anything they could come up with would be less interesting than the actual situation they are in, the writers all start to write about their experiences being locked in the theater. And then wanting to create more drama for the story, the writers start sabotaging the food and water and electricity, and eventually they resort to self-mutilation, violence, and cannibalism so they can frame it as torture that they were all forced to endure. There are also a bunch of short stories in the book, and the most famous one is called Guts, which chronicles the story of 3 male self-pleasuring incidents that went horribly wrong, one including someone inserting a carrot into themselves through the back door. Goodness. Another story is about a young boy who inserts a stick of candle wax into his male parts and it gets stuck up in his bladder, which leads to a block, which results in blood seeping from his genitals. But wait, there's one more that's somehow even worse. If you are a family member or like my mom or dad that is watching this, I'm sorry. I'm a degenerate. I'm sorry. But anyway, the last one is about a man who sits on a water intake valve at the bottom of his pool because he likes the way that it feels. The only issue is that the suction ends up being too much and it starts to suck his guts out from him, and he is forced to gnaw his way through his own entrails in order to save himself. So yeah, I can definitely see why this novel is this far down on the iceberg. This sounds like something that I will eventually hate read because I am intrigued, but I know that it will permanently change who I am as a person, so maybe I'll have the wisdom to stay away. Level 4. Rage is a 1977 psychological thriller novel written by Richard Bachman, who is actually Stephen King. Yeah, he wrote under a pseudonym for a while because he was worried that his books were selling based on his name alone and not on the merits of his actual writing. It was discovered pretty quickly who he actually was, though. This book is on this iceberg because it is about a school shooting, which is a topic that is sadly familiar to a lot of people, especially us Americans. The story centers on Charlie Decker, a high school senior who is expelled by his principal after hitting his chemistry teacher with a pipe wrench. Upon hearing the news that he is expelled, he storms out of the principal's office and grabs a pistol from his locker. He then kills his algebra teacher before taking the entire class hostage. A history teacher tries to intervene and Charlie kills him as well. The students then start discussing what is troubling all of them in an attempt to appease Charlie. The class kind of becomes an impromptu therapy session for all the students, and all of them are eventually allowed to leave except for a single jock named Ted. Ted attempts to make a break for it, but he is brutally beaten by all of the other students and left in the room with Charlie in a catatonic state. Eventually, the police enters the room and shoots Charlie, who survives the incident but is put in a mental institution. The book is notable because it seems to take inspiration from actual school shootings that have happened. This has led to Stephen King feeling uncomfortable with the novel, and it's remained largely out of print for that reason. King doesn't really have any plans to bring it back anytime soon. This book is definitely disturbing in its subject matter, especially if you live in America, as it is a situation that could happen to anyone. I haven't read the book, but I've read some of the more intense sections, and they were pretty unnerving. In general, I'm actually not the biggest fan of Stephen King's writing. I loved Carrie, but his style just isn't for me. That's not to say he's a bad writer, because he's an absolute legend and a great writer, but my general aversion to his work is one of the reasons that I haven't read this book yet. Naked Lunch is an impressionist nightmare written by William S. Burroughs. This isn't really a book, as it doesn't follow a defined narrative, but it's a series of routines and habits and odd stories that tend to focus on one particular drug addict. The book is really bizarre and features a world that is similar to our own, but also slightly dystopic. The book is disturbing and controversial due to its depictions of sadomasochistic parties and a particularly odd sequence where a man with a talking anus has the anus slowly take over the rest of his body and like absorb him. I read some of this in preparation for this video and the whole thing reads like a fever dream. I think that's the point though. It feels like an avant-garde novel, which is certainly an interesting premise. If you want to read something incredibly strange and feel like you're on drugs, then maybe give this a shot. It's really easy to find a free PDF of this book. The Wasp Factory is a 1984 novel by Scottish author Ian Banks, and it is a real doozy. It is the story of a 16-year-old boy named Frank who lives on a remote island with his dad and very few other people. His brother Eric no longer lives with them. Frank is known to torture and kill small animals in a variety of ways, and is haunted by the memory of a dog attack that resulted in the loss of his genitals when he was younger. This has led to his resentment of women, especially since the attack coincided with the last time he ever saw his mom before she left for good. We learn that Frank's brother Eric is actually in a mental institution that he was put in forcefully after forcefully feeding maggots to local children and then committing arson. The title of this book comes from a mechanism that Frank has made from a clock that he uses to torture and kill wasps. He puts the wasps in the clock, and behind each number on the clock face is a different method of killing to be used on them. He then sees these choices that the wasps make that result in their deaths as some sort of prophetic inspiration that he uses to attempt to tell the future. We also learn that Eric went mad after working in a hospital and treating a baby who needed its skull held together with a metal plate. One day the child was smiling at him, which was really unusual for a newborn baby. He checks underneath that metal plate and he finds that the newborn's brain is being eaten alive by maggots. And I won't spoil the ending for you, but it goes in a really strange direction that I have to imagine would have been controversial at the time. Overall, the book has a very loose narrative and is mostly disturbing for its in-depth descriptions of violence done towards animals and small children. Of all the books that I have talked about, this is one that I definitely think I will read in full on my own. I read a couple of sections from it, and I know kind of the broad strokes of the novel, but the idea is really intriguing to me, and maybe I'll make a full video on this book someday if people are interested. The Great God Pan is an 1894 fantasy horror novella written by Arthur Machen. It has been the inspiration for a lot of great horror authors that we know today, such as Bram Stoker, H.P. Lovecraft, and Stephen King. The book centers around a story of a mysterious woman named Helen Vaughn. Death and despair seems to follow her all over the place, and she makes several friends who go insane after seeing her play with a strange naked man when she was a child. It's pretty weird stuff. The beginning of the novella tells of an experiment by a doctor on a woman with the goal of opening her mind so she can experience the spiritual world. The doctor performs minor brain surgery, but the woman only awakens terrified and seems to have suffered brain damage as a result of the doctor's experiment. Most of the disturbing content seems to come from the fates of the people that come into contact with Helen, as well as her just general existence and where she came from. The book definitely feels like it inspired the French film Martyrs, as well as Rosemary's Baby, since there are some similar aspects between those movies and this book. One thing that I love about all these old horror stories is reading what the general reception was at the time of their release. This book was heavily criticized and thought to be the twisted works of a sick individual, and many people wanted the book banned and destroyed. But now it is regarded as one of the greatest horror books ever written. I'd recommend it if you like classic horror. It's not so disturbing that it would scare off most horror readers, so I don't know why it's really this far down in the iceberg, but I'll definitely be giving this one a full read myself one of these days. Outer Dark is another Cormac McCarthy novel that tells the story of a woman who gives birth to her brother's baby, so we're off to a good start there. While she is recovering from giving birth, the brother takes the baby and leaves it for dead in the woods in order to avoid the responsibility of taking care of the child. The book then tells two stories, one of the brother and one of the sister. In the brother's story, he sets out to find work and ends up working a series of jobs and being falsely accused of crimes for which he is constantly pursued. He is also followed by a group of three men who seem to kill all of those people that wish to do him harm. The brother stays on the run from the three men as he fears that they will eventually kill him. At the end of the story, he finds his son, who is burnt on one side of his body and also missing an eye. The trio then catches up to him, and they accuse him of fathering and abandoning the child before killing it and then starting to eat it. The story of the sister tells of her pursuing after the child after finding an empty gravesite near her house. She follows the trail of the child for a while before finding a man who actually found the abandoned child and is refusing to give him back since she was the one who abandoned him. After giving up and living with another man for a while, she leaves and comes across the dead body of her child and the body of the man that discovered him. Overall, this story is sad and definitely disturbing, with themes of incest and murder and cannibalism. All of that is kind of par for the course with Cormac McCarthy. I've read a lot of his books, but I hadn't read this one before, so I would definitely check it out if you're interested in his writing. Maybe start with something a little less intense like No Country for Old Men. That book is phenomenal. 2666 is the last novel written by Roberto Bolaño. It is over 1,100 pages long and mostly tells of a series of 300 murders in a fictional city that was inspired by the real-life city of Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. The book is split into 5 sections that follow different characters throughout the city over the course of the novel. The disturbing aspect of this book is the sheer amount of detailed descriptions of the murders of so many women. There are hundreds of pages devoted to explaining how the woman died and how the police are just too incompetent to catch the person that is doing most of the killing. Femicide is a real issue that Mexico struggles with to this day, and this book was written in part to shine a light on that issue. In that way, the book doesn't really feel cruel or mean-spirited in its portrayal of violence committed towards women, but it is brutal and upsettingly close to what happens on a daily basis in the real world. The title of the book is also a mystery, as the author died before the book was fully published. It is speculated that in the Bible, there were 2,666 years between the creation of the earth and the exodus from the Jews from Egypt with Moses. It could also be a play on the number 666, which is associated with the devil, although the number does not appear in the novel itself. Level 5. Perfume, The Story of a Murderer, is a 1985 literary historical novel written by German writer Patrick Suskind. It's probably not how you say his name, but oh well. The book follows the life of an orphan who finds that he has an exceptional sense of smell. It's certainly an odd premise, but the book does a lot with that. The boy, named Jean-Baptiste, lives his childhood being fostered by a local tanner. One day he comes across a young virgin girl that has a smell that he has never smelt before. Being overwhelmed by the scent, Jean thinks that he alone should possess it, so he kills the girl and stays with her until the scent is completely gone. He then works as the apprentice for a perfumer for a while. He is a prodigy at this, given that he has his exceptional ability to smell things really well, but he grows tired of the world and humanity and chooses to run away and live in a cave for a couple of weeks. It is during this time that he realizes that the reason he is so unloved by the world is that he doesn't have a scent of his own. He disguises his scent using some items that people normally have around them, and notices that those around him end up treating him much better. Now, thinking that scents can change things and change the perception of the world, Jean sets out to make the perfect scent. He finds another young girl who has the same scent as the girl that he killed years ago, and is determined to kill her and extract her scent in 1 year. During this year, he kills 24 other young women in order to practice extracting their scents. He kills the girl and extracts her scent, but he is caught for the murder and sentenced to death. Before being led to the gallows, he applies the scent of the girl to him, and it causes the crowd around him to fall in love with him and praise him with awe and adoration. He's let free by the local magistrate who cannot resist the smell, and the entire town participates in a mass orgy that is quickly forgotten after the fact by everybody. The effect that this scent has on people makes Jean realize that he hates humanity even more since they're so easily deceived. He then travels back to Paris, pours the entire bottle of perfume on himself, and attracts a crowd of people around him. They are so in love with his scent that they are compelled to obtain parts of his body, so they tear him apart and eat him before coming to their senses and saying they did it all out of love. Definitely a unique book with an interesting premise. The idea of someone being torn apart and eaten is definitely very unnerving. Also, the fact that the main character is kind of a remorseless serial killer who is obsessed with the idea of extracting scents of young women is just eerie. Some of the descriptions in the book of the violence are pretty brutal, but it's still less intense than some of the other stuff we have covered so far, so it's definitely worth a read if that premise sounded interesting to you. I'm Thinking of Ending Things is a 2016 psychological thriller novel written by Ian Reid that I absolutely love, but I don't think it should be this far down on the iceberg. The book centers around a couple that are going to see the boyfriend's parents for the weekend out in the country. The book is narrated through the point of view of the woman who is thinking about breaking up with her boyfriend named Jake. There are certainly some unsettling moments. The woman seems to have a stalker that leaves cryptic messages on her voicemail, and there is a particularly tense scene in the basement of the parents' house when they're there. I could see this being on this iceberg. I would just maybe put it a little further near the top. If you're the person who made this and you're reading this, I don't think you did a bad job. It's just this book to me wasn't that disturbing, but I definitely understand why people would think it is, because there are themes of like suicide and self-harm as well. But like I said, I absolutely adore this novel, and I will not spoil the ending for you. If you are interested on hearing a full analysis and summary, then go watch my other video about this book. I have a whole long video where I break everything down. If you're going to read any of the books on this iceberg, then this one would 100% be my recommendation. It's seriously an incredible book, and it got turned into a pretty decent movie. I don't think the movie is nearly as good as the book, but it still had some fun moments in it nonetheless. It was still pretty good. Nothing particularly violent happens in the book for the most part. Almost all the horror is psychological. The book is definitely unsettling though, and it gets really creepy near the end. But even if you aren't a fan of horror,
I would recommend this book just to anybody. It's really that good. The Virgin Suicides is one of the strangest books that I've ever come across, for one reason in particular that I will get into in a bit. It was written in 1993 by Jeffrey Eugenides, I think is how you pronounce his name, and it tells the story of 5 young girls who lived sheltered lives and were obsessed over by a group of local boys. The book starts with the death of one of the girls, Mary, and then we find out that a year before Mary died, her sister Cecilia slit her wrists in the bathtub in an attempt to kill herself. She was rescued by a neighborhood boy who snuck into the home to creep on the girls. Later, after recovering, she jumps out of her second-story window and is impaled on a fence during a party they're having for her. She dies almost instantly. This death is what prompted the parents of the girls to keep a closer eye on them and make them live increasingly sheltered lives. We learn of Lux, who is one of the sisters who has sex with unknown men on the roof of the house at night. It's kind of weird. This book is framed by a group of grown men who are thinking back on their experiences of what it was like growing up around these girls. Even as these girls are shown to be struggling or actively trying to kill themselves, the boys still look at them with lust and reverence. That is probably the most unsettling part of the book for me. The actual suicides of the girls, including a group suicide at the end, are certainly distressing, but it's the way that these men still fawn after them and seem to show no remorse even into adulthood that makes the story feel like uneasy. The women are just reduced to objects despite the fact that they were teenagers struggling with mental health. Now, while you're reading this novel, you might see this as a wonderful satire of the romanticization of young teenage girls by a group of horny loser adults, but you would be mistaken. The author of this book actually sees nothing wrong with the way that the boys sneak around and try to get a look up the skirts of these girls who, again, are killing themselves and struggling with mental health. All of this creepy ogling that is done by these grown men isn't supposed to be horrifying. It's supposed to be like relatable and respectable. The author is actually really creepy to me, as the boys in the story are, and he doesn't even know that about himself. That's what makes the book so eerie to me, knowing that the person who wrote it supports this behavior of these weird, again, creepy men romanticizing. I mean, now they're adults, they're romanticizing essentially how these teenage girls looked when they were like 14, and instead of like being like, we should have helped them, they're like, man, I should have snuck into her house and stole her underwear one last time. It's really weird. So if you want to read this book as a satire, then go ahead. I think it reads pretty well that way. It almost is like a dark comedy. But just know that every unbelievably creepy thing that is said or done by this group of men is seen as acceptable and reverent to the man who wrote the book. Big yikes. Tender as the Flesh is a 2020 dystopian novel written by the Argentinian author Agustina Bazterrica. This is another book that I have covered extensively in another video on this channel. Definitely go give that video a watch if this book sounds interesting to you, but too gross for you to want to read it on your own. The book is about a dystopian society where all meat has been deemed infected due to a virus that has ravaged the earth. The only meat now that is mass-produced and safe for consumption is human meat. So humans are factory farmed like livestock are today. Our main character is the operations director of a meat processing plant, and the first half of the novel is mostly learning about the processes that are used in the meat industry. We learn that humans are bred in captivity, have their vocal cords removed, and are branded for every year of their lives. They get branded every single year again. These human women are bred by studs who are male humans that are chained up and given the task of reproducing with the females against their will. We also see that there are men who stun the humans with a blow to the head before they are sent to the slaughterhouse to be processed into meat, which is another brutal and disgusting process. We are also told that child meat is considered a delicacy and that the children are essentially chained up from birth in order to grow more fat on them. Some humans are also sold to people to act as a source of meat, and they are gradually carved up over time as more meat is needed. They are kept alive as long as possible during this process. Our main character seems to be growing sick of the meat trade and slowly stops eating human meat. He is gifted a female that he keeps in his barn because he doesn't want to butcher her. He eventually then impregnates the female and keeps her locked in his house. This book is really unnerving, and almost all of the processes described in the human meat trade are processes that are done to livestock today. I'm not a vegetarian personally, but this book did make me a lot more aware of some of the awful conditions that animals are kept in. If you aren't particularly squeamish and the premise sounds interesting, then I would give it a read. It's a very depressing novel, and it definitely made me feel a little empty when I finished reading it. Like I said, I have a full video on this book, so if you're interested, please go give that a watch. Elect Mr. Robinson for a Better World is probably the most intriguing novel that I've seen on this iceberg. There isn't a ton that I could glean without actually reading the entire novel by myself, but it seems to be a novel about a former school teacher who wants to run for mayor. The book is set in a dystopian future where the education system has been fully defunded and intense violence is now completely normalized and accepted in society. The book is apparently incredibly surreal, and the reviews suggest that this book is also darkly comedic, but also very disturbing. I am like 99% sure that this book is going to be the subject of my next deep dive video, and I've already ordered a copy of it for myself. Sorry that I couldn't find much on it, but I wanted just to tease an upcoming video from this Iceberg, and this book has caught my interest more than anything else that I've seen on her, mostly due to the lack of information available on it. They All Died Screaming is the first book on this Iceberg that feels like it's trying a little too hard to be disturbing. It's a book about two separate narratives that seem to kind of barely connect. The first is about a disease going around that causes you to essentially become a screaming zombie, like you literally just scream until you die. In that story, we follow a group of absolute degenerates that spend most of their time having weird sex with each other and just being scummy in general. There's not very many redeeming characteristics of anybody in this entire novel, really. The second plot thread is about a boy who is kidnapped by a farmer who makes him work on his pig farm. Only the pig farm is actually a veal farm, and that veal farm is actually just a bunch of kidnapped teenage girls that the farmer butchers and then sells at the local market. Because this book wants to be disgusting, the farmer also regularly engages with intercourse with the pigs on his farm. Of course he does. At one point, the kidnapped boy, who is now almost an adult, forces himself on the locked up teenage girls. The farmer isn't even mad at him for this and almost blames himself for it, like, sorry I didn't teach you about the birds and the bees, kid. This book really seems like it's just trying to be gross for the sake of being gross. It goes beyond the point of being disturbing and just comes off as edgy. This could be the intention of the writer, though. They wanted something darkly comedic and just like how insanely depraved it is. I don't have any intention of giving this book a full read through, but if you've read it and I'm missing something, then please let me know. I love a good disturbing novel, but this one just really failed to capture my interest. But anyways, on to the last layer of this iceberg. Level 6. Hogg is a novel written by Samuel R. Delany over the course of about 3 decades. This is where we're going to get into some seriously depraved stuff, so if you aren't interested in hearing the worst of the worst, then go ahead and please watch a different video. This novel tells the story of a young boy who is sold into sexual slavery to a predator named Hogg. He then exposes the boy to the most extreme acts of depravity imaginable. This includes the group molestation of women and other acts involving the use of bodily waste. It's all very gross. Every single chapter in this novel contains graphic sexual or violent acts, and there is absolutely no chill when it comes to describing the worst things you could possibly imagine. The book also takes place in Porntopia, which is a land where any situation can ramp up into something depraved and sexual in a matter of moments. It's really no use detailing every little disturbing act that happens in this novel. It's full of sexual assault, and the main character and Hogg are paid to bring a group of men around and assault various men and women. In between scenes of graphic sexual violence, we get some small reprieves, like a man attempting to pierce his genitals only for his willy to start bleeding and leaking pus. We also learn of a boat captain who keeps his own 12-year-old daughter around so he can repeatedly abuse her both physically and sexually. Throughout the story, the narrator is abused by every single person imaginable, including a police officer. He is unable to catch a break and has just been conditioned to accept this horrible abuse as a simple fact of life. There's no hope for him. This book is highly debated among literary scholars because the content is horrible and depraved beyond all measure, but the writing is seen as legitimate and skillful like the prose is. At this point, I'm not reading much of these books. They're just a little bit beyond my pay grade. Like, sorry if you wanted somebody to do like a full in-depth analysis of all these books, but YouTube would probably just nuke my channel if that was the case. Proxy is a compendium of 5 out-of-print books by Peter Sotos. They all detail the lives of terrible people who abuse and victimize children and prostitutes and all manner of people. The books are essentially literary pornography and are also highly controversial. Go figure. Some of the books are speculative works of fiction of the hypothetical killers of real-life murder victims. This is seen as being in poor taste due to the exploitation of real people in order to make up a fantasy about sexually abusing children. Peter Sotos was incredibly controversial throughout his entire career and seems to be one of the first people to start openly praising serial killers and murderers. He had a magazine that described the murders of children by depraved individuals in exciting detail and very intense detail. We're at the point where it's hard to recommend these books in good conscience. They're mostly seen as almost historical in the way that they were produced and how they were received, but the content is truly revolting and has to come from somebody with a truly disturbed and messed up mind. I can understand writing horrifying stuff about fictional scenarios, and I have enjoyed books that are disturbing with their content, but using the real life deaths of children to essentially write fan fiction is crossing a line that I can't really condone. Just don't seek this stuff out. It'll probably just make your life worse. Scorch Atlas is a book that is actually notably more tame than the last book that we covered. This is a 2009 novel that details an apocalyptic dystopia. The book is meant to appear as charred and bloody, which is a really cool concept, like the actual physical book looks like that. The novel is a collection of short stories about a world that is truly devoid of all hope. Every single character in this story suffers from disease or violence in some sort of terrible, awful way. We have stories of illnesses that essentially make you shed all your skin and leave you writhing in pain. It's not a pretty sight. This book has been compared to The Road, which we talked about earlier. The key difference being that there is no goal or motive in these stories. It's just suffering and futile attempts at survival. The book isn't nearly as grotesque as the previous two books that we've covered, and it's probably the only book on this layer that you should consider reading. There's one further down that is not so terrible either. Even though this book is comparatively tame to what has come before, don't be fooled. This isn't going to be like the Chronicles of Narnia. This is a book about mutilation and endless suffering that will probably make you very sad and depressed, but at least it isn't glorifying child murder, which seems to be the bar that we have set for ourselves now. Cows is a novel by Matthew Stucco, where a man lives with his overbearing mother and seeks to create an ideal life for himself modeled after his favorite sitcom. He also works at a slaughterhouse and gets promoted to being one of the people that actually slaughters the cows. He finds that there are a group of men in the slaughterhouse that sneak away at lunchtime and drill holes into the sides of live cows and then use that hole to pleasure themselves. There's also just a lot of sexual assault and gross things that happen just like in all of these books. The main character's mother is also legitimately awful. She terrorizes her son and even crippled his dog. He eventually kills his mother and starts to fantasize about killing humans rather than cows. He also then meets a group of talking cows in the sewer, and they all conspire to kill the boss of the slaughterhouse. Our main character gets his paranoid girlfriend pregnant, who's just completely off the rails, and she ends up cutting the baby out of herself and then dying of the blood loss. Our main character also kills the head of the sewer cows that can talk and ends up getting with that cow's cow girlfriend. The whole book is really weird, and it falls into the funny but disturbing category that we've seen a bit of. This book is definitely gross in its subject matter, but it's not in as poor of taste as some of the other books in this section. It's not written nearly as well as something like Hogg, though. It's just a pulpy novel that details some of the most absolutely disgusting subject matter you'll ever come across. Disgrace is a 1999 novel written by J.M. Coetzee. It tells the story of David, a white South African professor who is chased out of town due to his grooming and coercion of a young girl at his university. This novel also takes place during the apartheid area of South Africa. This book is much less graphic than those that we have covered in this tier. The disturbing elements of this book come from just how terrible of a guy our main character is. These books are filled with the typical senseless random violence, but David is also methodical in his way that he victimizes the woman in his life. That's what makes it a little bit more disturbing and eerie. That's not to say that the book is devoid of shocking content. David's daughter is sexually assaulted and forced to keep the baby of her attacker. David is also set on fire at one point but manages to live through the incident. It's really just a miserable book, but it was praised on release. This book is probably the least intense book on this tier for this video, but that doesn't make it an easy read. The book feels like it was designed to break the reader, just to make you feel that the world is an evil place filled with evil men that never really have to face accountability for the terrible things that they have done. And lastly, for the first video on this iceberg, we have This Sweet Sickness by Patricia Highsmith. This is a novel about a man who stalks and obsesses over a woman who has previously rejected his advances. This book isn't nearly as graphic as what's come before and probably shouldn't be this far down on the iceberg. I could actually recommend this to most people without them risking resenting me for the rest of their lives. We follow the story of David, who is in love with Annabelle. She doesn't want anything to do with him though, but he is convinced that they're going to get married. She marries someone else and he ends up buying a house close to them so he can spy on her. He is just absolutely certain that she will leave her husband for him. This book is eerie in the sheer level of delusion that the narrator has towards this fake relationship. It reads like the manifesto of an insane person, and actually being the subject of his fixation would be an absolutely terrifying experience. The reason that this book seems so effective is that it was written by a woman, and so I think she just has more experience like knowing what would be scary. And I imagine if you're a woman reading this, it would probably be a lot more disturbing than like me reading it. We do eventually get some murder, which is pretty typical for these books, but the true horror is in the tension that is constantly building and just never releases. You always have the feeling that David is going to do something terrible, but the book keeps you guessing as to how far he will really go when it comes to pursuing his imaginary love. But yeah, definitely one of the lesser disturbing novels, but again, I think if you're a woman, this would definitely be further down on this list. It's really freaky. And that is it for part 1 of this video. If you guys like this and you want to see more, then I will definitely make a part 2 in the same format as this one. I've only covered about 1/5 of the iceberg, so we still have a lot more disturbing books to cover. And then just remember to subscribe and like the video if you haven't already. I know every YouTuber says that, but I am like really close to 1,000 subs and would love to hit that goal by the end of April. But thank you guys so much for watching. It really does mean a lot to me, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.